In the Golden Age, in the world of tradition, lived a race of men without kings. So they were referred to because each man was a king unto himself, shining with solar light, providing his own inner axis. These men without kings were free because they were sons of truth. But as the material world is subject to the turning of time and the entropy that accompanies it, gradually men lost their inherent regal nature and thus had to seek it externally. And so arose the practice of initiation, which would bring men back in touch with that sense of being and inner stillness that would allow them to shine brightly once more. A king for men was chosen from among the initiated ones, as only an initiate who had reawakened his latent regality could lead the less capable into the kingdom of heaven. But even that too decayed with time, and initiation was replaced with consecration. A king was raised up from the warrior caste and anointed by the priestly caste to create this inner synthesis of both temporal power and spiritual authority. Through the mediation of the priests, the supernatural fire flowed into the man who would be king and lifted him on high above all distinctions of caste. Regardless of the circumstances surrounding his coronation, the sacred king provides the central axis of the world of tradition, around which all else revolves. He is the Lord of justice and peace, the Dharma-Raja, the Chakravartin. He wields a temporal might over worldly affairs as he seeks to order his empire in line with the cosmic law, but he also wields a spiritual authority as Pontifex, the builder of bridges, through which the law from above flows down to the people. A hierarchy coalesces around him, one which is based in a victorious and creative presence, rather than a conquering and destructive violence. The sacred king wields the two swords of auctoritas and potestas, and in him the qualities of the priestly and warrior castes meet, and form something greater than the sum of its parts, a true regality that is above any caste. Perhaps one of Julius Evola's most controversial ideas is to be found in his views on the hierarchical relationship between royalty and the priesthood. His somewhat idiosyncratic position on this matter has set him at odds with other traditionalist school philosophers, particularly Rene Guenon. Evola's position is that regality enjoys a primacy over priesthood, just as the sun has primacy over the moon and the man over the woman. The qualities of the priestly caste and the warrior caste come together in the office of the sacred king, who by virtue of immanently embodying the regal function is above and beyond caste once he takes the crown, holding authority over both spiritual and temporal affairs. The dispute seems to arise from a disagreement over whether the warrior caste, also known as the kshatriyas, has primacy over the priestly caste, also known as the brahmanas. That is, who is above the other in the hierarchy of castes. Evola opens up this chapter with a reference to the Upanishads, in which it is said that the stock of the warrior deities arose from Brahman as a higher and more perfect form of Brahman itself. The passage reads thusly: "In the beginning this, the kshatriya and other castes, was indeed Brahman, one only. Being one, he did not flourish. He specially projected an excellent form, the kshatriya. Those who are kshatriyas among the gods, Indra, Varuna, the moon, Rudra, Parjanya, Yama, death, and Isana. Therefore there is none higher than the kshatriya. Hence the brahmana worships the kshatriya from a lower position in the Rajasuya sacrifice. He imparts that glory to the kshatriya." At first, this seems to support Evola's position. The kshatriyas were created with a special eminence attached to them, and therefore they have primacy. They are closer to the source and above the brahmanas. Specifically mentioned is the Rajasuya sacrifice, a ritual which elevates the king to the status of a chakravartin, and in which the brahmana imparts the glory or fame that belongs to him to the kshatriya. That is to say, when the king is anointed by the priest for the Rajasuya sacrifice, the king becomes as a brahmana himself. The priest says to the king, "You, O king, are Brahman." However, the verse continues. The brahmana is the source of the kshatriya. Therefore, although the king attains supremacy in the sacrifice, at the end of it he resorts to the brahmana, his source. He who slights the brahmana strikes at his own source. He becomes more wicked as one is by slighting one's superior. The remainder of the verse seems to cast doubt on the true position of the kshatriya, but Evola explains this like the relationship between a mother and son. While the king owes respect to his mother, so too does he owe respect to the priests. But when he is exercising his regal function, both his mother and the priests must bow to him and yield to his authority. Evola also says, in the same text, the priestly caste that was assimilated to that Brahman, understood here in an impersonal manner and in an analogous sense to what in Christianity is considered to be the power or dunamis of the Holy Spirit, which is in its safekeeping, was represented as a mother or maternal matrix in relation to the warrior or regal caste. This is particularly meaningful. The regal type is presented here according to its value as a male principle, which surpasses, individuates, masters, and rules triumphantly over the spiritual force, which is conceived of as a mother and female. There are numerous ancient traditions and mythologies which include a type of regality that was attained by marrying a divine woman, who was sometimes portrayed as the king's mother. This is related to a symbolism of certain initiatic greater mysteries that were linked to the reascent, and of transcendental manhood regaining the upper hand over the feminine, which dominates the material realm. In Hermeticism, also called the royal art, it is said that there is first a regime of woman, of the waters, of the moon, of whiteness, in which woman has the upper hand over man and has reduced him to her nature, to a state of material becoming. However, once the man has been dissolved in the feminine principle, then comes the regime of man, of the sun, of fire, of redness, and the man then reduces the woman to his nature, to a state of transcendent being. To indicate this second phase, the symbolism of incest between mother and son was sometimes used. The concept of investiture, or consecration of kings by the priestly caste, is a relatively recent necessity and represents a degeneration away from the pure world of tradition, in which it is said that there lived a race of men without kings, those men who were all kings unto themselves and manifested the world of tradition within themselves through their own principle of being. As the decline set in, sacred kings were needed as an access point, and initiation was the means by which to bring a man back to regality, and a further decline still saw initiation replaced with consecration. One could be forgiven for making the error of believing the priests to have primacy over the kings, for it is the priests who have access to the supernatural power, and it is their purview to bestow it upon a would-be king. However, in the rite of consecration, the king receives a supernatural power that the priestly caste does not own, but holds in custody as mediators of those forces. Once invested in a king who is drawn from the warrior caste, that supernatural power is supposed to rise to a higher form that it never could achieve before in the hands of the priests. The virile warrior quality is then freed, rising to a higher plane where it can act as an axis of that supernatural and sacred force. It is said in the laws of Manu that the priest is said to be the root of the law and the ruler is the peak. We can perhaps understand the sacred king more deeply through the tarot card of the Emperor. The Emperor is essentially the sacred king, plus the imperial element that empowers him to impose the way of the heavens onto the earth. The Emperor is seated on a throne, embellished with ram's heads, relating the card to the astrological sign of Aries, which is related to the conquering solar victory of the sun. He is cloaked in red, symbolizing the Hermetic rubedo, the regime of man and the sun. The Emperor wears a domed crown, following certain traditional symbolism that required the Emperor to be square on the bottom and round on the top, representing that he is a mediator between heaven and earth, and that the respective powers are united in his nature. The Emperor does not hold any weapons, but only a scepter and a sphere. We'll recall that the scepter is an axial symbol, and so too is the sphere, both of which are emblematic of the king's role as the axis of the wheel, the chakravartin. He needs no weapons, unlike the warrior, because he now wields a spiritual authority, an authority that has its source in the divine. His spiritual might is so great that lesser men bow before him like blades of grass in the wind. The king who has true authority has no need of force, coercion, or violence. He has a magic of spiritual profundity filled with wisdom, obtained through experiential knowing. The more one knows, truly knows that is, has divine knowledge, the more one knows and is capable of action, the greater his authority. The king is endowed with authority because he is something, he knows something, and he is capable of something. He is like a god or descended from a god. He knows the nature of the divine. He is capable of action. To this extent, the king can lay down the law, that is, the law from above. It is this authority alone which underpins the true power of law. Displays of force and lies are what weak men take recourse to when they lack true authority. But where there is authority, where there is the breath of the supernatural, where there are the rays of the light of the sun in all its symbolic majesty, where there is the profound fire of victory and glory, of vareno, any compulsion is entirely unnecessary. And so we can see how a king who grasps at political power is already out of touch with that victorious solar force that is the source of spiritual gravitas. Eventually, decadence began to set in, and problems arose in the relationship between regality and priesthood, and it is the origins of this conflict that are at the root of the matter of this hierarchical relationship. In the Symbols of Sacred Science, Rene Guenon documents an interesting evolution of symbolism between the boar and the bear. He notes that in the Celtic tradition, which he points to as a junction between the Hyperborean and Atlantean traditions, the wild boar was emblematic of the Druids and their spiritual authority, and the bear was emblematic of the knights and their temporal power. He points to a Hyperborean origin in this symbolism, which is significant because Hyperborea has links with the primordial world of tradition, and so such symbols provide us with a unique link to the Golden Age, which is our reference point for the world of tradition. Guenon also points to the Vedic tradition, a direct descendant of the Hyperborean lineage, and notes that the wild boar was the third of the 10 avatars of Vishnu, and that according to the Hindus, our current cycle of manifestation is designated as the cycle of the wild white boar. He says that there was a polar sacred land called the land of the wild boar, which is of course a reference to Hyperborea, though it has been known by many other names, and is called Varahi in Sanskrit, sharing a root word, var, with the word for boar, which is Varaha. This is significant because Guenon says that the first spiritual authority resided in Hyperborea, and that all other authority emanates from this original authority. And so it is natural and expected that later representatives of that primordial spiritual authority would receive the symbol of the white boar as their emblem and distinctive mark. The boar is a solitary animal, and to the Druids represented the isolation they kept themselves in from the outside world. For both the Celtic and Vedic priests, this isolation took the form of a forest retreat, which is related to characteristics of that Hyperborean primordiality, and it is that primordiality which must be reflected and retained in every spiritual authority worthy of the role and function. Over time, the symbolism of the boar started to merge with, and even in some cases shift into, the symbolism of the bear. Guenon points to an interesting case of the constellation that we now know of as Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and says that it used to represent the boar in more ancient times. He says that this substitution of names is one of the marks of the struggle between the boar and the bear, the revolt of the temporal power against spiritual authority, and that the first manifestations of this revolt extend far back beyond even the start of the Kali Yuga. We can also look to the Greek myth of the Caledonian boar hunt, which Guenon believes is symbolic of the revolt of the kshatriyas who claimed a decisive victory. The boar is typically described as white, which is also the color associated with the priestly caste, while Meleager, who dealt the death blow to the boar, is a prince who is often depicted wearing a red cape, which is the color associated with the warrior caste. The first blow to the boar was dealt by the huntress Atalanta, who was suckled by a bear as a child, and whose name may indicate that the revolt of the kshatriyas began in Atlantis or with the heirs of Atlantean tradition. Some esoteric and occult rumors point to an Atlantis whose priests had degenerated into black magicians, and so perhaps the revolt of the kshatriyas was not uncalled for, though other stories tell of Atlantean kings who became corrupt, power-hungry, and eager for war. In any case, such a conflict is a sign of one or both castes losing touch with any transcendent connection. However, these two castes were not always in conflict, and Guenon points to the legend of King Arthur, who has the name of the bear, and Merlin, the druid, who represent a normal and harmonious relationship between the two castes. He says a conclusion can emerge from the Celtic tradition that spiritual authority and temporal power were not always at odds and separated as differentiated functions, but were united in their common principle. Evola too points to the problem extending back into the dark ages of prehistory, where the conflict between regal and priestly authority was already brewing, as both claimed for themselves a primacy that, in truth, can only belong to God. Evola says it is a common misconception to think that this conflict was rooted in a desire for political hegemony, but rather it had its roots in two opposing spiritual attitudes. One way that such problems arise is when the priestly caste demands that the regal authority should recognize and submit to their hierarchical authority, as consecration involves the blessing of a lesser person by a greater one. However, it is a downright heretical and anti-traditional stance to refuse to recognize the spiritual authority of the king. The priest is only a mediator and interpreter of the divine. Though he may be quite powerful in his own right, he is still approaching God from a submissive position. The sacred king, on the other hand, feels himself to be of the same stock as the gods, their equal, and so he cannot tolerate claims of supremacy from the priests. The priest only channels the supernatural forces, whereas the sacred king embodies those forces immanently. An analogy would be to think of the supernatural forces as sound vibrations. Those sound vibrations are required in order to generate music. At some point, a composer hears a musical theme in his head and sets it down on paper, and then finds a conductor and an orchestra to perform it in order to create the song he envisions. Each instrumentalist in the orchestra represents one part of the supernatural force, or the sound vibrations. Independently, they do not make a song. The conductor must coordinate them into a coherent whole, all playing in time with a singular focus. We can think of the priests like the conductor. It would be foolish to credit the conductor with the composition of the song, because the creative action does not come from the conductor any more than it comes from the priests. The priest is a conduit for the supernatural forces, just as the conductor is a conduit for the song. Indeed, we have previously outlined the problems that arise when priests begin to say of the supernatural force, "This is me, I made this," as this causes the priests to fall into ego. Evola says that later times then saw the emergence of an anti-traditional anarchy that typically took one of two forms, and in both instances, a heterodoxy was destined to emerge from the traditional world. The first of these forms was a royalty that held only temporal power in revolt against the spiritual authority of the priests. In this case, the kings no longer immanently embodied a supernatural force, and therefore lacked any spiritual authority and virility themselves, but were merely figureheads with political power. This path led to the hegemony of the political element, the creation of the idea of a secular state, the destruction of all authentic forms of hierarchy, and a purely illusory and materialistic view of virility and power that will only be swept away by the masses in their collectivistic versions. This secular state power only maintains its hold on the world through force, fear, and fraud, and not only do modern political leaders not embody any spiritual gravitas, but they often openly mock the idea of any sort of divine authority. Without any transcendent power to underpin their rule, secular leaders are very much subject to the whims and hysterias of the masses. The second form was a spirituality of an essentially lunar character, rebelling against a solar spirituality embodied by kings who are at least still dimly aware of their true ancient and regal function as the gateway to the divine for those in their stewardship. This path runs parallel to the first and is initially manifested through what Evola calls the civilization of the mother and its pantheistic and devotional spiritualities, which elevate the lunar feminine principle above the solar masculine principle and attempt to subjugate that which is solar to that which is lunar. The Middle Ages saw perhaps the last significant play on this stage, and in a modern way exemplifies the historical conflict between the religious universalism represented by the Catholic Church and the regal ideal still embodied in the Holy Roman Empire, albeit in a flawed and compromised way. The emperor is, according to the regal idea, the caput ecclesiae, or head of the church. He does not take the place of the pope, who is the head of the priestly caste, which is a different role. However, it is only in the imperial function that the spiritual forces represented by the church, and which animate Christianity, can properly and efficaciously impose their dominion. It is through the empire that heaven is manifested on earth, and the function of mystical salvation is attributed to the empire. The empire, as we recall, represents a dam of order and stability against the disruptive forces of chaos. The emperor, having been consecrated and invested with divine power, claimed his power and his right to rule directly from God, and acknowledges only God above himself. As such, the Pope could have no authority by which to revoke the supernatural force with which the emperor was endowed by excommunicating him. Once the emperor has been imbued with that solar glory, he embodies it, and it cannot be removed or revoked. Evola remarks that according to the ancient symbolism, the empire had always and everywhere been compared to the sun, and the church had been compared to the moon. He says that even at the time of her highest prestige, the church attributed to herself an essentially feminine symbolism, that of a mother, in relation to the king whom she viewed as her son. The Upanishads' designation, the brahmana as the mother of the kshatriya, appears again in this symbolism, this time in concomitance with the supremacist fancies of a gynecocratic civilization marked by an anti-heroic subordination of the son to the mother and by an emphasis on the mother's privileges. When the Pope assumed the title of Pontifex Maximus, it was more or less a usurpation, since Pontifex Magnus was originally the function of the sacred king, not the function of the head of the priestly caste. Evola remarks on the characteristic symbol of the papacy, the double keys, and notes that they were borrowed from the ancient cult of Janus, one key of gold and one of silver, linking them to the greater and lesser mysteries, and which open and close the gates to the kingdom of heaven. Janus himself was a god of initiation, and thus the symbolism of the double keys retains an initiatic and royal quality rather than a religious quality. All of these distortions and shifts away from the dignity of regality testify to a significant deviation from the world of tradition. In Introduction to Magic, Volume 3, Evola has included an essay titled Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power, in which he responds to the critiques of Rene Guenon. Evola first sums up Guenon's position. According to Guenon, every normal and traditional civilization is characterized by the primacy of spiritual authority over temporal power. As soon as temporal power emancipates itself, and especially when it claims to subjugate the spiritual authority for contingent and political goals, an involutive process begins, and the development of civilization slides steadily downward. Eventually, the representatives of temporal power can no longer maintain their position, causing a breakdown that leads to the world of materialistic and rebellious masses. What this means is that when temporal political power disconnects itself from the spiritual, as we see today with so many nations which avow the separation of church and state, and especially when it co-opts the spiritual to serve political ends, then society begins to come apart. Lacking the real authority and gravitas of true leaders imbued with spiritual virility, modern leaders must increasingly rely on force and lies to conceal their weakness and maintain their position, which is always untenable. And so today we have a world filled with masses who are deeply sunk into materialism with no real spiritual direction and who rebel against state authority. It is perhaps not surprising that democracy was the natural outcome of this process, a system of government in which the masses believe they should and do hold the power, while politicians are forever trying to win the favor of the masses who are fickle and prone to hysterics and whims. Evola says that he largely agrees with Guenon's position to this point, but where they diverge in their thinking is where and how the problems arise. Firstly, what is the basis for spiritual authority? And secondly, who might legitimately represent it? Evola is careful to point out that these considerations are not restricted to more recent times, in which the warrior caste has been limited to political and military functions with little sacred about it, and in which the priestly caste has also shown a degeneration away from what it originally was. Evola writes, "As we have seen, Guenon clearly distinguishes knowledge from action, attributing the former to the priestly caste, the latter to the warrior caste. But on a higher plane, this is a relative distinction. Guenon himself has often emphasized that knowledge in the metaphysical and esoteric sense and realization, action, are inseparable. Thus, admitting that action is the special field of competence of the warrior caste, the possibility always remains of conceiving of it as the basis for a higher realization. We cannot see why Guenon, when dealing with the warrior caste, considers only the material kind of action, and that which serves only temporal interests and realizations." The Bhagavad Gita from the Vedic tradition, which we have already acknowledged as a tradition that is a direct descendant of the Hyperborean lineage, is essentially a celebration of the warrior tradition and an instruction manual for how action can become the pathway to heaven and liberation. As the warrior Arjuna questions Krishna as to the necessity of action, after Krishna has just finished explaining to him the importance of knowledge and understanding, Krishna says, "In this world there are two main paths, the yoga of understanding for contemplative men, and for men who are active, the yoga of action. Not by avoiding actions does a man gain freedom from action, and not by renunciation alone can he reach the goal." Krishna later says, "Fools say that knowledge and yoga are separate, but the wise do not. When you practice one of them deeply, you gain the rewards of them both. The state reached by true knowledge is reached by yoga as well. Both paths lead to the self, both lead to selfless action." When Krishna speaks of yoga here, he is speaking of a union with the divine, and of a selfless kind of action that is done because it must be done in order to be in line with Dharma, and without sentimentality or attachment to the fruits of one's actions. And this action is a necessary part of the cosmos. Even though he is God, Krishna explains that even he too must act, and he says, "In all the three worlds, Arjuna, there is nothing I need to do, nothing I must attain, and yet I engage in action. For if I were to refrain from my tireless continual action, mankind would follow my example and would also not act, Arjuna. If I stopped acting, these worlds would plunge into ruin, chaos would overpower all beings, mankind would be destroyed." Further, Krishna says, "He who fails to keep turning the wheel thus set in motion has damaged the working of the world and has thus wasted his life, Arjuna." And only by selfless action did Janaka and the other wise kings govern and thus assure the well-being of the whole world. Both of these verses point to a relationship to regality. As we know, the sacred king is the spinner of the wheel, the Chakravartin, and Krishna directly speaks of a king like this. Like these sacred kings, Krishna too must spin the wheel of the cosmos, and so we see a connection between God and the sacred king who embodies godlike qualities. We can begin to understand from these passages how important action is, and because it is a selfless, dharmic, non-attached action, we can also detect the relationship to contemplation. The word vritti in Sanskrit is related to the image of the revolving cosmos. while yoga is related to the ability of the mind to find a still center point within the constant turnings of materiality. Through action, one finds the stillness of contemplation. Through contemplation, one finds the ability to act as the unmoved mover. So when Evola says that action and contemplation are non-different on a higher metaphysical plane, we can understand that the two things are so intimately intertwined as to not be able to have one without the other. And the sacred king, being regal and above and beyond caste, blends both action and contemplation, both spiritual authority and temporal power, into something greater than the sum of its parts. Evola says, regal majesty, that blend of Olympian detachment and power that is characteristic of the true rulers, the irresistible force of command, the august and supernatural aura that surrounds the heroes and the sovereigns of the traditional world, all that represents something equivalent, though realized above all on the basis of action and the nature of a kshatriya, a warrior. In his own booklet by the same title, Spiritual Authority and Temporal Power, Guenon emphasizes that these two powers were not separate in the original primordial state, but contained in the common principle from which they emerged, and of which they represent two indivisible aspects, indissolubly bound in the unity of a synthesis that is both superior and anterior to their distinction. Therefore, Evola counters by saying that neither the sacerdotal or regal function is further away from the origins than the other, and neither is less able than the other to serve as the basis for the eventual reintegration of that primordial state, but also that the original primordial caste, which corresponds to that original unified power, had a more regal rather than sacerdotal character. To put this simply, in the beginning the two castes and their respective powers were contained in one common principle. They were not split up into two distinct things, and this corresponds to the race of men without kings, those Golden Age people who expressed both contemplation and action in that higher state where they are essentially the same thing. It is only as a result of degeneration that the two became separate and distinct, and the castes were then formed. Evola believes that this race of men without kings necessarily had a regal character, as after all, they were kings unto themselves. And so for this reason, Evola gives primacy to the regal rather than the sacerdotal. He also considers that this problem is a sort of East versus West problem. The general trend of the West has typically been more active than contemplative, having as its predominant ideal the warrior or king rather than the priest or magician. Some might say that this is itself evidence of the degeneration of the West, but this is not necessarily the case, as this difference between East and West goes back to the most ancient esoteric traditions. He points to the Hermetic ars regia, which literally means the royal art, to which we referred earlier, and in the Hermetic tradition he writes, "It is interesting to note that in Hermetism, the white work is always subordinate to the red work, and as a consequence, the light is subordinated to the fire. This is no mere variation of symbols, but an eloquent signature for the experienced eye, because the hierarchical associations of such symbols within other traditions are the opposite and not by accident. It can be observed that where white and light take primacy, they denote a spirituality that may eventually also have an initiatory character, but which falls predominantly within the boundary of contemplation, knowledge, and wisdom, and so is nearer the sacerdotal tradition than the royal. But when the red and fire take primacy, they are indications of the royal mystery and the magical tradition in the higher sense. In Hermetism, the latter primacy is clear." This reversal of symbolism is found repeated elsewhere, including, for example, in the hierarchy of elements, which in the East favors air over fire, but in the West favors fire over air. Also in the East, the color white corresponds to the sattvic guna, the highest of the three modes of being, while the lower guna of rajas corresponds to red. Knowledge, too, is often symbolized by the white lunar light. This Eastern hierarchy has even filtered over into Catholicism, where the Pope is dressed in white, while red is worn by the princes of the Church, that is, the cardinals. By contrast, the whole of the Western Hermetic tradition, along with many schools of magic, employ the reversed symbolism. The albedo, or white regimen, is always placed under the feminine lunar sign, while the superior rubedo, or red regimen, is overseen by fire and the color purple, corresponding to the Olympian, solar, virile, and kingly nature that it produces. This variation in symbolic expression speaks to a specific form of traditional instruction that is best suited to a warrior nature, and Evola says that to underrate this arrangement by way of the thesis that the supreme authority can only be legitimately held by the priestly caste is not only unjustified, but also dangerous. Evola asserts that one of the most basic causes of the distress of Western civilization is the fact that a population that is essentially composed of a kshatriya spirit has for centuries lacked a fitting soul, and that the spiritual authority that has come to predominate in the West is thoroughly priestly in tone, so as to cause an unhealthy dualism or else compromises that are anything but constructive. The one and only spiritual authority that the West can obey without violence and denaturation is that which takes shape on the basis and in the framework of the kshatriya tradition. The issue Evola takes with Guenon's framing of decadence is that Guenon characterizes the problem as having its roots in the revolt of the warrior caste against the priestly caste, rather than political power revolting against spiritual authority. Evola concedes that if Guenon had expressed it in those terms, rather than pitting two castes against each other, he would have been correct, but instead he makes his point contestable because it assumes, as a given, a hierarchy of castes that is not consistent within traditional civilizations, such as ancient China, which had a celestial royalty but no priestly caste, or the ancient Norse, whose kings were legitimized by virtue of being descended from the Aesir. And in other cases, the opposite is seen, where the priestly caste sought to take political power for themselves, such as in ancient Egypt and ancient Persia. Evola rather prefers to generalize by saying that in the whole cycle of Hyperborean-derived civilization, the takeover of a priestly spirituality represented both a disintegration and the effect of outside influences linked to a southern matriarchal civilizational cycle that is at odds with the Hyperborean tradition. Evola's thesis is thus that the primacy or predominance of a warrior or regal tradition versus a sacerdotal and priestly tradition is not indicative of any lowering, decadence, or involution, and neither is the primacy of action versus contemplation. Examples of both can be found within the world of tradition. What does constitute an involution or degeneration is the loss of contact with metaphysical reality, and it does not matter whether that loss occurs first within one caste or the other. It can equally occur when the sacral and initiatic concept of regality degrades into a merely temporal and political function, or when the original priestly function degenerates into ecclesiastical and clerical survivals, opaque dogmatic forms, and relationships of simple devotional religiosity. In one form or another, decadence has long been at work in the world, and particularly in the West. The issue is not which caste is to blame for this, as both have suffered the loss of contact with the transcendent. Rather than both castes maintaining a vertical gaze, they have instead shifted their gazes to the horizontal plane, and it is on the horizontal plane of time and matter that petty ambitions arise. The way is high, but their eyes are on the ground, and so the rest of humanity has followed them ever downward. Evola says that the first condition for an effective reaction against such decay would be to re-establish contacts with metaphysical reality, though he considers that extremely unlikely. Man could languish for another 1,000 years in the current state of suspended animation, gripped by decadence, confused, overwhelmed by material sickness, and degenerating ever downward into his own dysfunctional nightmare. On a civilizational level, there is no practical way to escape the monumental collapse that is rapidly approaching. To watch it unfold is akin to observing a lifeless body falling down a hill. But despite the desperation of the current age, the pivotal question must be asked: how does one remain standing amidst the ruins of our civilization? That is, how do we live a meaningful and integral life while everything disintegrates around us? The answer is to live in harmony with our true nature, to be who we really are inside, to not allow the undertow of the world to pull us down, and to set out on a path that is heroic and visceral, that unites the disparate elemental forces present in us and channels them into something higher and more worthy of life. For it is in the moment of extreme heroism that the warrior opens the door to transcendence, and ultimately this is the goal of all study of the world of tradition, to remind us of what we once were, what we should be today, and what we shall be again. The civilization that Evola conceived of in a reborn Europa is one that embraces its warrior lineage, not the barbaric or brutal variety, but rather of a deeply ascetic self-conquering that produced a transfiguration of the individual soldier. As he writes in the Metaphysics of War, the true warrior ideal implies not only force and physical training, but also a calm, controlled, and conscious formation of the inner being and the personality. Love for distance and order, the ability to subordinate one's individualistic and passionate element to the principles, the ability to place action and work above mere personhood, a feeling of dignity devoid of vanity, are features of the true warrior spirit as essential as those which refer to actual combat. So that from a much higher point of view, combat itself can be worthwhile, not so much for its immediate material results as for evidence of those qualities which have a self-evident constructive value and can amount to elements of a special style, not only in a given area of the nation devoted specifically to soldiering, but also in a whole people and even beyond the frontiers of a given people. He continues on saying, the main thing consists instead in a certain inner style, a certain formation of the mind and character, a simplicity, clarity, and harshness, a directly experienced meaning of existence, without expressionisms, without sentimentalisms, a pleasure for commanding, obeying, acting, conquering, and overcoming oneself. The bourgeois democratic world order is a reign of worms, of forms without life and lacking inner fortitude, and the war waged by this order is devoid of higher meaning, impersonal and without spiritual light. Perhaps in the next age we shall see the re-emergence of a new type of man, sufficiently steeped in a new culture, less vain, less humanist, shunning the trivial and material and reflecting an ancient warrior tradition that is aroused by the spirit of combat and consecrated by victory over the elements of chaos in both the inner and outer world. And then, these great warriors will unite the world of spirit and the element of action, the integration of priesthood and knighthood into the new man, a fighting monk, a holy warrior, one who has liberated himself internally from his lower elements and transfigured his passions through the fire of self-conquest into a life form that serves the highest principles of pure transcendent being. And perhaps one day we can then once again become a race of men without kings.
In the beginning there was indeed Brahman, oneness in all creation, projecting the cosmos vast, split into many castes, reflects his glorious light.
Raised up through magic right, possessed of sacred sight, wielding a temporal mind, to become transcendent, the mandate from heaven, to bring the law from above.
The poor and the bare,
Oh, fire and air,
the priest or the knight,
who will guide us to the light?
oh, how we all long for the light. Oh, how we all long for the light. Hyperborean, sword of the warrior, evoking primordial height. United with priestly caste, domain of sacred task, relying on eternal sight.